Emma stood behind the counter of her small bookstore, arranging a display of new arrivals when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up to see a tall man with dark hair and warm brown eyes entering the shop. Something about him made her heart skip a beat. Perhaps it was his confident stride or the thoughtful expression on his face as he scanned the bookshelves. "Good morning," Emma said with a polite smile. "Can I help you find something?" The man turned toward her voice, and their eyes met. "I hope so," he replied with a charming smile that made little creases appear at the corners of his eyes. "I'm looking for books on historical architecture. I'm working on a restoration project downtown." "You're in luck," Emma said, coming around the counter. "I just got several new titles in that section last week." She led him to a corner of the store where sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating shelves of architecture books. As she pulled out several volumes for him to consider, Emma couldn't help noticing his hands, strong but gentle as they turned the pages. He introduced himself as James, an architect who had recently moved to town to work on restoring an old theater building. "This is perfect," James said, selecting 2 of the books. "You really know your inventory." Emma smiled. "This store has been my whole life for the past 2 years. She didn't add that it had become her refuge after her painful divorce, the one place where she felt completely in control. "It's a beautiful space," James said, looking around at the cozy reading nooks and carefully arranged displays. "You can tell it's cared for by someone who truly loves books." Something in his voice made Emma look up at him more carefully. Unlike most customers who made small talk, James seemed genuinely interested. His eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary, and Emma felt a warm flush spread across her cheeks. As she rang up his purchase, their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected tingle up her arm. Emma quickly pulled her hand away, surprised by her own reaction. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" James asked suddenly, his voice casual but his eyes hopeful. "I'm new in town and don't know many people yet. Plus, I'd love to hear more about your book recommendations." Emma hesitated. She had closed herself off from dating after her ex-husband's betrayal, focusing entirely on making her bookstore successful. The thought of opening herself up to potential hurt again made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "I don't usually," she began. "It's just coffee," James said with a gentle smile. "No pressure. The new cafe down the street has amazing pastries too." Something about his easy manner and the sincere look in his eyes made Emma reconsider. Perhaps it was time to start living again instead of just existing between the pages of other people's stories. "Okay," she said finally, "coffee would be nice." They agreed to meet the following afternoon. As James left the store with a wave and another heart-melting smile, Emma found herself watching him through the window as he walked down the street. For the first time in 2 years, she felt a spark of something new, a tiny flame of possibility. That night, Emma found herself standing before her closet, considering what to wear for their coffee date with more care than she had given her appearance in months. She tried on and discarded several outfits, finally settling on a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. As she lay in bed that night, Emma wondered if she was being foolish. One coffee date didn't mean anything, she told herself. Yet she couldn't stop thinking about James's smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the gentle way he'd handled her beloved books. "It's just coffee," she whispered to herself in the darkness, echoing his words. But deep down, Emma sensed that meeting James might be the beginning of something that could either heal her heart or break it all over again. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying as she drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with warm brown eyes and the promise of tomorrow. Emma arrived at the cafe 5 minutes early, choosing a small table by the window where she could watch for James. Her fingers nervously played with the pages of the book she'd brought along, a habit from childhood that resurfaced whenever she felt anxious. When James walked through the door, her heart quickened. He wore a simple blue button-down shirt that complemented his broad shoulders, and his face brightened when he spotted her. Emma realized she'd been holding her breath. "You came," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. "I did promise," Emma replied with a shy smile. "Though I almost changed my mind 3 times this morning." "I'm glad you didn't." James' eyes held hers and the genuine warmth in them made her cheeks flush. They ordered coffee, a latte for her, black coffee for him, and fell into easy conversation. James asked thoughtful questions about her bookstore, and Emma found herself sharing how she'd saved for years to open it after college. It was always my dream, she explained, to create a space where books could find the right people. Like matchmaking for readers, James said, making her laugh. When she asked about his architecture work, his face lit up with passion. I love breathing new life into old buildings, he explained, finding the beauty that's been hidden under years of neglect. Something in his words resonated with Emma. Wasn't that what she needed too? Someone to see the beauty she'd hidden away after her heartbreak. Their coffee date stretched into 2 hours. When they finally left, James asked if she'd join him for dinner later that week. Emma surprised herself by accepting without hesitation. Over the next few weeks, James became a regular fixture in Emma's life. They explored the city together, discovering hidden parks and quaint restaurants. On rainy evenings, they'd talk for hours in her apartment, sharing stories from their past, though Emma carefully avoided mentioning her divorce. One night, as they walked home after dinner, a sudden downpour caught them without umbrellas. They ran laughing through the rain, taking shelter under the awning of Emma's bookstore. Water dripped from James's hair down his face, and without thinking, Emma reached up to brush it away. His hand caught hers, holding it against his cheek. The air between them changed, charged with something electric and inevitable. James leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, but Emma found herself rising to meet him. Their first kiss was gentle, questioning, then deepened as Emma's arms wrapped around his neck. The cold rain and the busy street faded away until there was nothing but the warmth of his lips and the solid feel of his arms around her waist. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Emma felt something inside her shift and settle. For the first time since her divorce, she felt fully present in her body, fully alive. I've been wanting to do that since the day we met, James whispered, his forehead resting against hers. What took you so long? Emma teased, surprising herself with her boldness. 3 nights later, James helped Emma reorganize a section of her bookstore after closing time. As they worked side by side shelving books, their hands would occasionally touch, sending tingles up Emma's arm. The store was quiet except for the soft music playing from Emma's phone and the occasional rustle of pages. I think this is the last box, Emma said, placing a final stack of poetry books on the shelf. When James didn't respond, she turned to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He stepped closer, gently taking the book from her hands and setting it aside. His fingers trailed up her arms to her shoulders. You're beautiful, he said softly. Do you know that? Before she could respond, his lips found hers in a kiss that was different from their first, deeper, more certain. Emma's back pressed against the bookshelf as James's hands cupped her face. The kiss grew more urgent, their bodies pressing closer together as months of built-up tension flowed between them. When James's lips moved to her neck, Emma gasped, her fingers tangling in his hair. The sensation of his mouth on her skin awoke feelings she'd thought long dormant. She wanted more, wanted to feel his skin against hers, wanted to let go of the control she'd clung to for so long. But not here, not yet. James seemed to sense her thoughts, pulling back slightly, his breathing as uneven as hers. I should go, he said reluctantly, his eyes dark with desire. Before I can't bring myself to leave. Emma nodded, though everything in her protested, as she locked the bookstore door behind him. Watching him walk away into the night, Emma realized with both excitement and trepidation that she was falling for James, and that soon she would have to decide if she was brave enough to let him completely into her life. The next morning, Emma woke to the chime of her phone. A text from James made her smile. He was thinking of her, couldn't stop remembering their kiss among the bookshelves. She hugged her pillow, feeling like a teenager again, before forcing herself to start her day. At the bookstore, Emma found herself distracted. She misplaced orders, gave a customer incorrect change, and nearly shelved a romance novel in the science fiction section. Her mind kept drifting back to James, the feel of his hands on her waist, his lips on her neck. When the door opened that afternoon and James walked in with 2 coffee cups, Emma's heart raced. They hadn't planned to meet today. I was in the neighborhood, he said, setting her favorite latte on the counter. His fingers brushed hers, lingering a moment longer than necessary. Lucky me, Emma replied, trying to sound casual despite the warmth spreading through her body. They chatted quietly as she worked, James leaning against the counter, occasionally helping a customer find a book. It felt so natural having him there, as if he belonged in her space. When closing time came, James flipped the sign on the door, while Emma counted the register. The silence between them hummed with anticipation. "Would you like to come to my place for dinner?" Emma asked suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness. "I make a decent pasta." James's smile was answer enough. At her apartment, Emma grew nervous as she prepared their meal. James moved around her kitchen with easy confidence, opening wine, finding plates without being told where they were kept. They worked together in comfortable silence, stealing glances and occasional touches. Over dinner, James asked about the photo on her bookshelf, Emma with an older couple. "My parents," she explained. "They live in Florida now. They look kind," he observed. "You have your mother's smile." Emma nodded, then took a deep breath. "James, there's something I should tell you." The words felt stuck in her throat, but she forced them out. "I was married before. It ended 2 years ago." James set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "I wondered if there was something," he said gently. Once Emma started talking, she couldn't stop. She told him everything: how her ex-husband's infidelity had blindsided her, how she discovered his affair with her friend, how the betrayal had shattered her trust and made her retreat into herself. "The bookstore was my salvation," she finished, "but I've been afraid to let anyone close again." James reached across the table, taking her hand. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said. His thumb traced circles on her palm. "I haven't been completely open either." He told her about his own heartbreak, a 5-year relationship that ended when his partner decided she didn't want the same future. "She didn't want children," he explained. "I'd always have." The honesty between them created something new, a deeper intimacy than physical desire. When James pulled her into his arms after dinner, their kiss tasted of vulnerability and wine. They moved to Emma's couch, where their kisses grew more urgent. James's hands slid under her sweater, warm against her skin. Emma tugged at his shirt, wanting to feel more of him. When their bodies pressed together, she could feel his desire for her, matching her own growing need. James pulled back slightly, his breathing rag. "Emma," he whispered, his voice rough. "I don't want to rush you." Emma looked up at him, at this man who had somehow slipped past her defenses. "I want this," she said, taking his hand and leading him toward her bedroom. "I want you." In her room, moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows as they undressed each other slowly, exploring newly revealed skin with gentle touches and kisses. Emma felt both nervous and certain as James laid her on the bed, his body covering hers. "Are you sure?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Instead of answering, Emma pulled him down to her, kissing him deeply. Their bodies moved together with increasing urgency, learning each other's rhythms. When James touched her intimately, Emma gasped, arching into his hand. "You're beautiful," James murmured against her skin. "So beautiful." As their bodies joined, Emma felt something inside her breaking open, not painfully but like a flower finally blooming after a long winter. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to be completely vulnerable, completely present in the moment. Afterward, lying in James's arms, Emma traced patterns on his chest. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "Of what?" he asked, kissing her forehead. "Of how much I could fall in love with you." James tightened his arms around her. "That doesn't scare me at all," he whispered into her hair. "In fact, I think I'm already halfway there." Over the next month, Emma and James fell into a sweet rhythm. Weekdays were filled with text messages and lunch breaks together, when James could get away from his project. Nights and weekends became precious time spent in each other's arms, discovering new layers of intimacy that left Emma breathless and wondering how she lived without this connection for so long. On a crisp Friday afternoon, James appeared at the bookstore just before closing time with an overnight bag slung over his shoulder and a mysterious smile on his face. "Pack something for the weekend," he said, kissing her cheek. "I've found us a little escape." Emma raised an eyebrow, intrigue. "Where are we going?" "It's a surprise. Just bring something warm for evening walks and something that makes you feel beautiful for dinner." 2 hours later, they were driving along the coast, windows down to catch the salt air. Emma watched James as he drove, his profile strong against the setting sun. When had this man become so essential to her happiness? The cottage James had rented sat on a secluded stretch of beach, a charming wooden structure with wide windows facing the ocean. Inside, Emma found a bottle of wine chilling, fresh flowers on the table, and a bed covered with plush white linens. "How did you find this place?" she asked, wandering from room to room. "I have my secrets," James teased, wrapping his arms around her from behind. His lips found the sensitive spot below her ear that always made her shiver. "Do you like it?" Emma turned in his arms. "It's perfect," she whispered before pulling him into a kiss that quickly deepened into something more urgent. They barely made it to the bedroom, clothes marking a trail behind them. James laid Emma on the soft white bed, his eyes dark with desire as he looked down at her. "You take my breath away," he said, his voice husky. Their lovemaking was different this time, slower, more deliberate. James took his time exploring her body, finding places that made Emma gasp and arch beneath him. When he finally moved inside her, Emma felt tears spring to her eyes at the intensity of her feelings, at how completely she had opened herself to this man. Later, wrapped in sheets with the sound of waves crashing outside, James traced lazy patterns on Emma's bare back. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," he murmured. Emma thought for a moment. "I write poetry," she admitted. "Nothing good, just private thoughts. No one's ever read them." James smiled against her hair. "Will you share one with me someday?" "Maybe," she said softly, "if I'm brave enough." They made dinner together in the cottage's small kitchen, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of lovers. After eating, James suggested a walk on the beach. The night was clear, stars scattered across the dark sky and reflecting on the water. They walked barefoot in the cool sand, hands intertwined. "I have something to tell you," James said as they stopped to look out at the moonlit ocean. "I got a call about a new project." Emma smiled up at him. "That's wonderful. Where is it?" "Chicago," he said quietly. Emma felt her body go cold despite the warm evening. "Chicago," she repeated. "That's far." "It would be for 6 months, maybe longer." James turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Emma, I want you to know that this doesn't change how I feel about you." But Emma barely heard him. Her mind was already racing ahead, seeing the inevitable end. Long-distance relationships never worked. He would meet someone new. History was repeating itself. "We should go back," she said, pulling her hands away. "It's getting cold." In the cottage, tension hung between them like a fog. Emma moved mechanically, getting ready for bed, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and hurt. When James tried to touch her, she flinched. "Talk to me," he pleaded. "Don't shut me out." "What's there to say?" Emma's voice came out sharper than intended. "You're leaving." "I'm not leaving you," James insisted. "Emma, I'm falling in love with you. We can make this work." The words Emma had longed to hear now felt like a cruel joke. "That's what people always say," she whispered, thinking of her ex-husband's empty promises. But things change. People change. James tried to pull her into his arms, but Emma stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. "I think I need some space tonight," she said, her voice breaking. She slept on the small sofa in the living room, tears silently tracking down her face as she listened to the waves and wondered how something so beautiful could shatter so quickly. In the bedroom, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to reach through the walls Emma had suddenly rebuilt around her heart. Morning light filtered through the cottage windows, finding Emma curled on the sofa, her eyes red from a night of little sleep. She rose quietly, making coffee and stepping outside to watch the waves. The beach was empty, the morning air crisp and clean. She wrapped her arms around herself, wondering how everything had changed so quickly. The sound of the door opening made her tense. James approached cautiously, 2 steaming mugs in his hands. He offered one to Emma without speaking, his own eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. "I'm sorry," Emma finally said, her voice barely audible above the surf. "I overreacted." James shook his head. "You didn't. I should have told you about the possibility sooner." He kept a careful distance between them, respecting her space. "Emma, I need you to know something. This job, it's a great opportunity, but it's not worth losing you." Emma looked at him sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can turn it down. Find something local." "I can't ask you to do that," Emma protested, though a selfish part of her wanted to accept his offer immediately. "You're not asking. I'm offering." James' eyes held hers. What we have, it doesn't come along often. Emma stepped closer to him, close enough to feel his warmth. Why would you give up such an opportunity for me? We've only known each other a few months. James set down his coffee mug on the railing and took her face in his hands. Because I've fallen in love with you, Emma, completely, and I don't want 6 months or 6,000 miles between us. The words hung in the air between them. Emma's heart pounded as she processed what he was saying. No one had ever put her first like this. I love you too, she whispered, the words both terrifying and liberating. But I can't be the reason you give up your dreams. There has to be another way. They spent the morning talking, really talking, about fears and possibilities. Emma shared how deeply her ex-husband's betrayal had wounded her, how she'd promised herself never to be vulnerable again. James listened, holding her hands tightly in his. I'm not him, James said simply. I won't hurt you that way. Somehow, against all her defenses, Emma believed him. They decided to enjoy their remaining time at the cottage, shelving the difficult decisions for later. Their reconnection was intense, as if the brief rift had only made their desire stronger. In the afternoon, James drew Emma a bath, scattering rose petals on the water's surface. He undressed her slowly, kissing each inch of skin as it was revealed. Emma sank into the warm water with a sigh, looking up at James with newfound openness. Join me, she murmured. He stripped quickly, sliding into the tub behind her so she could rest against his chest. His hands moved over her body beneath the water, caressing her breasts, her stomach, moving lower to where she ached for him. Emma turned her head to kiss him, her movements causing water to slosh over the tub's edge. Here, she whispered, shifting to straddle him in the bath. Water cascaded around them as she took him inside her, setting a rhythm that had them both gasping. James held her hips, guiding her movements, his eyes never leaving hers. I love you, he said again and again, like a prayer as they moved together. Afterward, they lay tangled in bed, damp skin cooling in the sea breeze through the open window. James traced the curve of Emma's hip, the arch of her back, committing her body to memory. What if? Emma said suddenly, voicing an idea that had been forming. I came with you. Not immediately, she added quickly. I'd need to arrange things with the bookstore, but maybe after a month or two. James propped himself up on one elbow, looking at her with surprise. You do that? Leave your store? I could hire a manager, Emma said, the plan taking shape as she spoke. It wouldn't be forever, and maybe I could look for a small space in Chicago, a satellite location. The hope in James's eyes made her heart swell. You really consider that? Emma nodded, surprising herself with her certainty. For us, yes. James pulled her into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair. Emma held him just as tightly, marveling at how fear could transform into possibility when you were brave enough to reach for what you wanted. That night, they walked the beach under the stars, making plans, imagining futures. When James kissed her under the moonlight, Emma felt something settle inside her, a certainty that whatever challenges came, they would face them together. After returning from their weekend at the beach, Emma threw herself into preparations. If she was going to join James in Chicago, there was much to arrange. She interviewed potential managers for her bookstore, created detailed operational manuals, and researched commercial real estate in Chicago neighborhoods. James left 2 weeks later. The airport goodbye was harder than Emma had anticipated, her body physically aching as she watched him walk through security. That night, alone in her apartment, she cried into the pillow that still smelled faintly of his cologne. They spoke every day, morning texts, evening video calls that often stretched late into the night. Emma would prop her phone on the pillow beside her, falling asleep to the sound of James's voice. Some nights, their conversations turned intimate, with whispered desires and the sound of quickened breathing across the distance. I miss touching you, James would say, his voice low and rough. I miss the way you feel against me. Show me, Emma would whisper back, her inhibitions dissolving in the face of her longing. These virtual encounters left her both satisfied and aching for more, a temporary relief from the constant wanting. 3 weeks after James left, Emma finalized arrangements with her new store manager, a retired literature professor named Margaret who shared Emma's passion for books. The lease for a small storefront in Chicago had been signed. the perfect location for a second branch of her bookstore. Everything was falling into place, yet Emma felt increasingly anxious. Was she making a mistake? Was she foolish to uproot her life for a relationship that was still so new? The night before her flight to Chicago, Emma sat alone in her half-packed apartment, doubt overwhelming her. She called her mother, something she rarely did with personal matters. "I'm scared," Emma admitted after explaining everything. "What if this is a terrible mistake?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Living cautiously might feel safer, Emma, but it's not really living. I've watched you hide in that bookstore for 2 years. Maybe it's time to be brave." After hanging up, Emma opened the small wooden box where she kept her private poems. She selected one she'd written about James and slipped it into an envelope. It was time to be brave indeed. The next morning, Emma locked her apartment, handed the store keys to Margaret, and headed to the airport with 2 suitcases and a heart full of both fear and hope. James was waiting at the arrival's gate, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand, the same kind that had grown near their beach cottage. The moment Emma saw him, every doubt vanished. She ran into his arms, dropping her bags, not caring who watched as he lifted her off her feet in a crushing embrace. "You're here," he kept saying against her hair, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "You're really here." The drive to James' apartment, their apartment now, was filled with tangled fingers and stolen glances. Emma felt like she was dreaming, the city lights blurring outside the window, as James pointed out landmarks and neighborhoods. "I have something to show you," he said as they pulled up to a handsome brick building. He led her up to the 3rd floor, unlocking the door with visible excitement. The apartment was bathed in soft light from dozens of candles, rose petals creating a path to the bedroom. But what caught Emma's breath was the wall of bookshelves in the living room, custom built, with a rolling ladder like the one in her store. "I wanted you to feel at home," James said, watching her face anxiously. "Is it too much?" Emma turned to him, tears filling her eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. She reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope. "I brought something for you too." James read her poem silently, his eyes moving over her most private thoughts, her deepest feelings now exposed to him. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Words seemed insufficient. They came together in a kiss that quickly blazed into something more urgent. Clothes were discarded as they made their way to the bedroom, falling onto the bed in a tangle of limbs and whispered declarations. Their lovemaking was different, deeper somehow, infused with the relief of reunion and the promise of a shared future. When Emma cried out her release, James held her close, whispering her name like a blessing against her skin. Later, wrapped in sheets and each other, they talked about everything and nothing, her flight, his work, plans for her new store. The conversation drifted into comfortable silence as Emma traced the lines of James's face, relearning him after their separation. "Welcome home," James murmured, kissing her fingertips. 6 months later, Emma stood in her Chicago bookstore, arranging a display of local authors near the front window. Sunlight streamed through the glass, highlighting the rich colors of the book covers and warming the wooden floors. The bell above the door chimed, and Emma looked up expecting a customer, only to find James entering with coffee cups and a small paper bag. "Thought you might need an afternoon pick-me-up," he said, setting her favorite latte and a chocolate croissant on the counter. His eyes lingered on her face in that way that still made her heart skip. "You're a lifesaver," Emma replied, stretching up on her toes to kiss him. "How was your meeting?" "Good. Great, actually." James leaned against the counter, watching as Emma sipped her coffee. "The restoration project is complete. The theater looks better than it has in 50 years. Emma smiled, pride warming her chest. "We should celebrate tonight." James reached across the counter to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Actually, I had something in mind. Can you close early?" There was something in his voice that made Emma curious. "Margaret can handle the original store for a few more days. I suppose I could put up the closed sign at 4 instead of 6. "Perfect," James said with a mysterious smile. Later that afternoon, James drove them out of the city. Emma watched the buildings give way to trees and open spaces, trying to guess their destination. When they turned onto a familiar coastal road, she realized where they were going. "The cottage?" she asked, excitement bubbling in her voice. James nodded, reaching for her hand across the console. I thought we were due for a return to where it all nearly fell apart, and then came back together. The cottage looked just as Emma remembered, though now wildflowers bloomed in the garden. Inside, everything was prepared for their arrival. Fresh flowers on the table, wine chilling, and the bed made up with crisp white linens. "When did you arrange all this?" Emma asked, wandering through the rooms touched by happy memories. "I have my ways," James replied, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness Emma couldn't quite understand. They walked along the beach as the sun began to set, the sky painted in brilliant oranges and pinks. James seemed distracted, his hand tense in hers. "Is everything okay?" Emma finally asked as they paused to watch the waves. James turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Emma, these past 6 months have been the happiest of my life." His voice was steady but emotional. "When you took that leap of faith to join me here, I knew I'd never meet anyone braver or more loving." Emma's heart began to race as James reached into his pocket and lowered himself to one knee on the sand. He opened a small velvet box to reveal a ring, a delicate diamond surrounded by sapphires the color of the ocean behind them. "Emma Sullivan, would you make me the happiest man alive and marry me?" Tears filled Emma's eyes as she looked down at this man who had helped her trust again, who had shown her that love could be a beginning rather than an ending. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes." James slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then stood to pull her into his arms. Their kiss tasted of happy tears and promises. That night, they made love with a new tenderness, a deeper connection. James worshipped every inch of her body, his hands and lips making Emma feel treasured beyond measure. When they came together, it was with whispered vows and declarations that went beyond physical pleasure to touch something eternal. Afterward, lying in James's arms with moonlight streaming through the windows, Emma marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From a chance meeting in a bookstore to building a life together, it seemed both miraculous and inevitable. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "About how close I came to missing this," Emma admitted. "If I'd let fear win, if I'd never let you in." James pulled her closer. "But you did. You were brave enough to try again." Emma lifted her hand, watching how the ring caught the moonlight. "I never thought I could be this happy again," she said softly. "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I almost gave up on us." "Never," James promised, kissing her forehead. "Not in this lifetime." As they drifted toward sleep, bodies intertwined and hearts beating in sync, Emma thought about the words she would write in her poetry journal tomorrow, about second chances, about the courage it takes to love completely, about finding home in another person's arms.